Welcome to the Will Miller Social Justice Lecture Series. I'm so pleased that we're able to bring Stephen Salata to Burlington to speak to us on the topic of Palestine, Long Road to Freedom, Reflections on Resistance to Occupation and Colonialism. Steve is an extraordinary scholar, political commentator, and activist. This lecture series was created in honor of Will Miller, my late husband, who was a social justice activist and University of Vermont philosophy professor for 35 years, who died in March 2005. As our logo states, he will always be remembered as a clear voice in a world of false words and disinformation. We could benefit from his energy, his intellect, his insights, and his imagination in these incredibly difficult times. This lecture series was created to bring speakers to the Burlington community and to the UVM campus to provide a radical analysis of social, ecological, and political concerns. Will set a courageous example in speaking truth to power. He showed boundless optimism and a passion for the truth. His voice was powerful, especially in encouraging others, students, staff, faculty, community members, and people from around the world to speak up and be heard. He showed a personal strength and an unwavering commitment to the struggle against war and for social justice. And he helped move others to activism. He was never afraid to speak his mind, put words into action, or place himself on the line, whether before the university trustees, on a picket line, at a barricade, or in each of the congressional offices. Will offered reasoned and insightful analysis into the origins and workings of capitalism and imperialism, giving us a call to struggle and a vision of a more just society. He advocated for a society where all work is valued, where truth is not silenced but is nurtured, where all are treated as equals, that is at peace with itself, and where people and resources are not exploited. And it was with that vision that we created this lecture series. UVM should not be a place where students and faculty should not only be a place where students and faculty learn about struggles for social justice, but it should also be a place where students, faculty, and staff continue to struggle against all forms of oppression, speak out against injustice, and speak up for justice. Will worked tirelessly for a faculty and staff union at UVM, and he would be proud of the work that United Academics is doing to negotiate a fair contract. At this point, I was going to quote from Steve's book, Uncivil Rights, this book right here, which is for sale over at one of the tables over here. At this point, I was going to quote from Steve's book, Uncivil Rights, Palestine and the Limits of Academic Freedom, where he writes about the discrepancies between faculty salaries and working conditions and administrators' salaries and working conditions. But not being an academic myself, I couldn't abbreviate his well-researched analysis and stay within my time limit. Suffice it to say, I thought I was reading something Will had said, and I encourage you to read this book as well as his most recent book. Both books are here and are for sale. We could not bring you these lectures without the generous support from members of our community, including many of you. Thank you to those who have already sent in donations. Tonight, donations can be made at our table, which is right over here, with our t-shirts and this book, Nationalism, Decolonizing Native America and Palestine. So we hope that you will be able to pick up at least one of these books. I lost my place. We also have self-addressed envelopes, if that would be helpful to you for taking away to send us a donation. You can also go to our website, www.willmiller.org. We send out information about our lectures through snail mail, email, and social media, so please sign our clipboards, which will be passed around. You can learn more about Will, the work he was involved in, and see his webpage, which one might describe as packed and primitive, as it was started in the days when one had to know how to write HTML code. A link to his page can be found on our webpage. It's still very fascinating. Many campus and off-campus groups and departments have sponsored this lecture. There are tables in the back of the room where you can find more information, or at the side of the room, where you can find more information about some of the works, some of the groups that are doing work locally. I'd like to thank Critical Race and Ethnic Studies, Global and Regional Studies, International Socialist Organization, Middle East Studies Program, United Academics Executive Council, Vermonters for Justice in Palestine, Peace and Justice Center, Black Rose, Rosa Negra in Burlington, Global Justice Ecology Project, Will Miller, Green Mountain Vets for Peace, Justice for All, New Hampshire Palestine Education Network, Students for Justice in Palestine on the Marlborough College campus, and the newly forming Students for Justice in Palestine here at UVM, along with the UVM Muslim Student Association. I'd also like to thank CCTV, which records all of our events and rebroadcasts them on Channel 17 and through their website so that our lectures continue to be available. Thank you to the lecture series board, Fred Magdoff, Helen Scott, Michael Cassidy, Ron Jacobs, and Isaac Kreisman. This event could not have happened without your efforts. Thank you to Patrick St. John for yet another great poster for this event. If you haven't already purchased one of Steve's books, after the Q&A period, you could get one, and Steve will sign them for you. Now I'd like to introduce you to Mark Hage, a member of Vermonters for Justice in Palestine. Mark has been involved in bringing this topic to the attention of Vermonters for many years, and we were fortunate to get to work with him on bringing this lecture to our community. Thank you.
Good evening, friends. On behalf of Vermonters for Justice in Palestine, I want to express our gratitude to the Will Miller Social Justice Lecture Series for bringing Stephen Salata to Vermont. This special event demonstrates the enduring commitment of this lecture series to make oppression and its causes visible and to stand in solidarity with the oppressed and those who struggle for justice. 100 years ago this month, Foreign Minister Alfred Balfour, Lord Balfour, on behalf of the government of Great Britain, the strongest imperial power of that age, endorsed Zionism and the creation of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. 2017 also marks the 50th anniversary of Israel's military occupation of the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and Gaza, and also, lest we forget, the Syrian Golan Heights. This is the longest military occupation of modern times, and together with Israel's illegal Jewish-only settlements, is made possible by the political, military, and diplomatic backing of this age's greatest imperial power, the United States. The conjuncture of these anniversaries is what brings us together this evening, but our collective responsibilities as citizens and activists should not end here. When I was reflecting on how to introduce Stephen Salata to you, I came across a passage from Frantz Fanon, doctor, revolutionary, and author of The Wretched of the Earth, among other works. And Fanon asserted, in decolonization, there is a need of a complete calling in question of the colonial situation. If we wish to describe it precisely, we might find it in the well-known words, the last shall be first, and the first shall be last. Decolonization is the putting into practice of this sentence. Stephen Salata, through his scholarship and activism, completely calls in question and inspires resistance to the settler colonial situation in Palestine and here in the United States, whose native peoples and cultures were among the first to be ravaged by colonialism and ethnic cleansing. Our guest speaker has taught at Virginia Tech and the American University of Beirut. He spent the summer of 2002 in Lebanon in the Palestinian refugee camp of Shatila, teaching Native American studies and developing approaches to constructing shared narratives between decolonization movements. In 2014, the University of Illinois, to its everlasting shame, fired Dr. Salata from a tenured position in the Native American Studies Department because of tweets he had written condemning Israel's savage and devastating attacks against Gaza that summer, which killed more than 2,000. Stephen Salata's books include Israel's Dead Soul, The Holy Land in Transit, Colonialism, and the Quest for Canaan. anti-Arab racism in the United States, in the USA, where it comes from and what it means for politics today, modern Arab American fiction, a reader's guide, and most recently, Internationalism, decolonizing Native America and Palestine. Stephen is also a regular columnist for Electronic Intifada and a member of the organizing committee of the U.S. campaign for the academic and cultural boycott of Israel. During some of the darkest and most repressive periods in South Africa during the fight against the apartheid regime, an indigenous African poet coined these lines in a poem. He said, "It is a dry white season, brother, but seasons come to pass." It is because of the work of scholars and activists like Stephen Salata and those they inspire that we can see an end to Palestine's dry white season. Would you please join me now in warmly welcoming to the University of Vermont scholar, writer, political commentator, and activist, Stephen Salata.
I've been told that this microphone is better, so we're going to give it a try. Is it working? Can you hear me well like this? Maybe you want to raise it? No. Okay. All right. I will carry it as well. How does this sound? Is this better? Okay. If my voice starts lagging, please wave your arms or yell at me and let me know. Well, thank you very much for spending your evening with me. It's more than an honor and a pleasure to be here. I'm going to talk just for a little while. I don't want to exhaust your ears any more than I need to, and that way we can have plenty of time for questions and comments afterwards. Very quickly before I begin, I want to thank all the folks who helped organize to make this evening possible. In particular, Ann Lipset, who has been a remarkable host, she's shown great hospitality and has been great company carting me about and listening to my idiosyncratic complaints about all kinds of things that no human being ought to be subject to, and also to Mark Hage for working with me for quite a long time to make sure that I could come out here. And I'm not an easy person to deal with via email, as in I tend not to answer them. So that's to his great credit that he stuck with me, even though it was unwitting, but although I was probably often very rude, and I very much appreciate the effort. And then finally, in the lead up to tonight, I had an opportunity to read about and as well as read the work of Will Miller. It was, for me, an extraordinary education, an inspiring education, and I feel all the better as a human being for having had the opportunity to read of and from him, and it's more of an honor than I can express to be able to walk in his footsteps this evening. So it's been a long time since my situation with the University of Illinois happened, and so I never have a sense of how much curiosity there might be about that interesting moment in my life. But just a qualification, really, before I get started, that you will not hear anything even remotely anti-Semitic coming out of my mouth tonight or any other night, for I am profoundly opposed to all forms of racism, including anti-Semitism, and including the forms of Zionism that put Muslim and Christian Palestinian Arabs into separate legal categories from Israeli Jews. I am a firm believer in basic humanistic notions of equality, whether that's in the United States, in Palestine, Algeria, or any place else. And I don't believe that any nation state has the right to accept itself from practicing equality, and that we in turn have an obligation, indeed a moral responsibility, to act against states that practice inequality at a systematic or juridical level. For me, once a sort of notoriety set in about my Twitter feed, and it wasn't really about my Twitter feed, it was about my work in the BDS movement, which I'll talk about in a little bit, and the kind of punishment that advocates of BDS are facing these days. It wasn't about a kind of absolution or justification for my political positions or the commentaries I made therein. It was about Palestine. I think as activists, community members, intellectuals, however you want to identify yourself, it's important to eschew a culture of celebrity and focus on the broader issues that generate local controversies. And so I'm going to repeat the same sorts of things that I've been repeating for years, since in fact well before I ever got onto the medium of Twitter. And in particular, start with a basic proposition that what we're dealing with in the so-called Israel-Palestine conflict isn't a conflict per se. Conflict as a term intimates some sort of equivalency, an equivalency of moral claims, or an equivalency of power, or an equivalency of rights and responsibilities. And in that sense, using that definition of the term conflict, what we're seeing is not a conflict. What we're seeing is a form of systemic oppression that arises from a project of settler colonization. And this is a much better and more accurate frame with which to understand what's happening in Palestine. So rather than calling it the Israel-Palestine conflict, we might refer to it instead as the colonization or decolonization of Palestine. What we're dealing with is essentially a national conflict. It is not a conflict over religion. It's not a conflict over ancient tribal rivalries. In fact, I would argue that the notion that Israel-Palestine is in conflict or in war, or however appellation you want to term it, is tacitly racist towards both Jews and Arabs. The idea that they've been feuding for thousands of years, that their feud is intractable, that it's unsolvable, that they just hate each other, right? Well, what kind of people just hate one another without some sort of historical or social basis for it, right? People don't just dislike one another, right? People dislike one another based on sets of conditions. And to say that this impulse to dislike is based on some sort of atavistic or cultural tendency is not only false, but leads us into very troublesome notions of cultural essentialism vis-a-vis all parties in historical Palestine. And so we need to think about it as a conflict over land, a conflict over resources, a conflict over national rights, and a conflict, as all such conflicts, over narratives and over certain perceptions of history. As Mark mentioned in his much too generous introduction, we have just passed the 100-year point of the Balfour Declaration, in which essentially the British state handed over Palestine to Jewish Zionist colonizers. It would take another 30-some years, 31 years, for the colonization to produce an actual nation state, but this is the moment that it was formalized or ratified in the eyes of the European powers. Since then, I'm going to give you a very, very broad history from the point of view of the Palestinians. In the period from 1947 to 1949, anywhere from 600 to 750,000 Palestinians were made refugees. The majority of them fled their ancient villages in historic Palestine because of the superior military capability of the fledgling Israeli army, but also because a handful of Zionist militias committed a series of massacres throughout the Galilee and in certain coastal villages, the most infamous being Deir Yassin. But there were others, Tartura, and they go on and on. And upon the word of these massacres sort of being spread around, a lot of people fled in fear. They fled under the assumption that they would return to their homes after the war had ended. The war ended, and they were not allowed to return home. And now, nearly 70 years later, they still haven't been allowed to return home. They remain refugees. There are some 5 million Palestinian refugees in the world. They live in substandard, very often miserable conditions in refugee camps in the Gaza Strip, in the West Bank, and in surrounding Arab countries, in particular Jordan and Lebanon. The Palestinians of the West Bank, numbering some 3 million, are subject to a disparate legal system from Israeli Jewish settlers. Depending on whose numbers you use, the settlers are anywhere from 400 to 700,000. It depends on the geography, it depends on your mapping, it depends on what you consider a settler. Those 3 million Palestinians get to use 10%, or according to some figures, less than 10% of the West Bank's water. And the West Bank's water largely comes from underground wells, and those wells have been emptied over the past few decades by Israel. So the settlers end up using 90 or a little bit more than 90% of the West Bank's water. The Jewish settlers, the Israeli settlers, have their own highways to drive on, from which the Palestinians are excluded. The Palestinians are restricted by a series of checkpoints, the vast majority of them accepting those who have a Jerusalem ID. In the West Bank, you either have a Jerusalem residency or you have West Bank residency. If you have West Bank residency, it becomes very difficult to travel abroad or to get back into your home, and it becomes virtually impossible to visit the holy sites in Jerusalem. In the Gaza Strip, conditions might be even worse. There are some 2 million people in Gaza. Gaza is a territory physically that is around twice the size of Washington, D.C., so it's a very small geography. It's one of the world's most overcrowded geographies, and the people there have been suffering for nearly a decade now an economic embargo, and they are restricted by land, air, and sea. Their lives are quite simply miserable. They don't leave the territory, and they can't get back into the territory. And any human being with a modicum of empathy should not be able to imagine any other human being living for even 5 minutes like the people in the Gaza Strip are made to live. It is a terribly difficult existence. The unemployment rate is anywhere from 49 to 54%. People, including children, die from cancer because their hospitals are understaffed and because certain medicines can't get in. They're unable to get treatment. They can't go to Israeli hospitals to get that treatment. Medicine is part of Israel's embargo. In 2014, over the course of 52 days, in Operation so-called Cast Lead, and I don't know who the hell comes up with these names. I really don't. I don't even know what Cast Lead means. But anyhow, and I don't even want to know, right? I'm sure it references something stupid. But there's no other possibility. But anyhow, over the course of 52 days, Israel killed over 500 Palestinian children and over 2,000 Palestinians in total. The people of Gaza live under the constant threat of invasion and bombardment. This is not a normal existence. This is not an existence that any group of human beings anywhere in the world would tolerate. And the Palestinians, as human beings, feel no differently than anybody else would. Inside Israel, inside what's often called 48 Israel, or Israel proper, outside of the West Bank and Gaza Strip, what many of us still refer to as Palestine, there are around 1.8, 1.9 million Palestinian citizens of the state. They live there as second-class citizens. They find it very difficult to get permits to expand their villages or even to add on to their homes. They go to schools segregated according to religion. Right? Mainstream Israeli politicians, I'm talking the prime minister, right? I'm talking the prime minister's cabinet, talking prominent Knesset members, routinely refer to them in the language of insects and are constantly threatening to kick them out wholesale. This happens all the time. Not even the most adamant defender of Israel can possibly deny that. It is a normal feature of Israeli political discourse. So as bad as Trump is, and he's horrible, right? Imagine an entire government of people speaking like this on a regular basis. In some cases, speaking in even more explicit terms about a community, right, under its control that's supposed to be a group of citizens with equal rights. Right? But a plethora of Israeli politicians through the years, including Ehud Olmert, including Ehud Barak, have admitted that Israel's Arab or Palestinian citizens suffer a second or even third-class existence. These are the basic conditions of Palestine. So if anybody wants to tell you that two people are fighting and they just need to sit down and have a dialogue and everything will get better, you can say, this is a nice idea. And we would love, as Palestinians, to have this dialogue after we're given our freedom, or after we earn our freedom. The dialogue occurs after the oppression ends, not before. The dialogue is not meant to absolve the occupier of guilt or responsibility for the crime that it commits against the native population. What we need is a redistribution of power, which is what we also need in the United States to solve the problems of racism in this country. What we need is equal access to resources. What we need is an actual functioning democracy that's not based on one's religion as the state chooses to define it. Right? In other words, what we need is equality. And that is the simple thing that Palestinians are asking for and what they've always asked for. There's a huge body of literature in Arabic, English, French, all kinds of other languages that constitute an intellectual tradition of Palestine's national movement. And in that literature, in that wide archive of literature, you will see the same idea being expressed over and over and over again, that we have no beef with the Jewish people as Jews, we have a beef with Zionism. And we have a problem with being subjected in our own homeland, and what we are fighting for is what all oppressed and colonized people have fought for, which is freedom. And this is a universal human sentiment that anybody ought to be able to understand, and that increasingly, even in the United States, more and more people are beginning to understand, much to Israel's chagrin and much to its anxiety. I would argue, in fact, that these days, when I examine the state of discourse around this so-called conflict, that Israel's actions have become indefensible. Please note that I didn't say Israel has become indefensible, but Israel's actions have become indefensible. And so if you're interested in this issue, hop on Twitter or Facebook or your social media of choice, read your favorite website, or actually some of the websites that you really can't stand, and look at what people are saying. about this issue. Look at how they discuss it. In particular, look at how they respond to any accusation that Israel is misbehaving. And you'll see a consistent discursive pattern, or a consistent pattern of discourse. It was very visible in the summer of 2014 when pictures were circulating of charred and maimed Palestinian bodies. Israel was starting to take a beating in worldwide opinion, and rightly so. Right? People were starting to complain about it. You even had like celebrities, sort of tweeting out, celebrities who had never said anything political, tweeting out "Free Palestine," and then some of them sort of retracting it. I guess once their publicist got on the phone and said, "What the hell are you doing?" But anyway, it was whatever else was going on. It was a bad PR look for Israel in terms of world opinion, or the world's moral consciousness. And, I was in the middle of these arguments, on Twitter, of course, and I kept hearing and seeing the same thing over and over again. You see, defenders of Israel weren't saying Israel is not bombing children. They weren't saying Israel is not bombing hospitals. Israel is not bombing UN shelters. Right? They were saying Israel is doing those things because the Palestinians are making us. Right? And this is an age-old colonial discourse, age-old to the point of cliche, in fact. It's the idea that the colonial society is pure of heart and pure of motive until it encountered an embodiment of a different type of humanity in the native. Right? It's Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness thesis, basically, right? Or the thesis that Conrad critiques, depending on your literary critical point of view. You see it in films like Steven Spielberg's Munich, right? Again, it's the idea that we're pure of soul, we're pure of heart. We had never thought to do such terrible things until we encountered these people, and then they brought out something dark in us that we didn't know existed, and that we would never deign to kill civilians, right? Unless we were made to by an inferior moral force. It's a horribly racist discourse, right? But that's what we see by way of justification of Israel's actions these days. We see a wholesale blaming of Palestinians, and in fact, one way that I know as a surefire method of what Israel is up to in any given moment is all I have to do is hop online and look what its politicians and its major media voices are saying that the Palestinians are doing. And whatever it happens to be accusing Palestinians of in that moment, I know that that's precisely what the IDF is engaged in. Right? It's foolproof, it never fails. It's not just psychological projection, it's a way of creating separate moral categories, one for the Israeli, one for the Arab. Another way that we can understand that Israel's actions increasingly are indefensible is because the Israeli state, Zionist organizations, and in many cases apologists for the Israeli state at an individual level are doing every single thing they can to prohibit criticism of Israel from even happening. We see this most clearly in the suppression of the boycott, divestment, sanctions, or BDS movement. But we've been seeing it for a long time. So I became infamous there for about 5-6 minutes a few years ago for getting fired from an academic position. But people need to understand that I'm certainly not the first one. Right? And, a lot of people got fired for their politics on this very campus. Right? But even beyond that, beyond the McCarthy scare, right? Just dealing with the issue of Palestine, a lot of faculty have been disciplined, including having their jobs terminated. A lot of people never got jobs in the first place. Right? A lot of people, graduate students, have been drummed out of academe. A lot of people have been told, no, you cannot pursue this line of research because I won't support you, or the department won't support you, or because you'll never get a job. Change your topic. And in this sense, in U.S. academe, Palestine remains remarkably understudied. I'd say in Western academe, that's the case more generally. So last year I went on the academic job market. I failed miserably, but I tried. And so I was looking at job ads, English language job ads. So I was looking in your Commonwealth countries, the U.S., You know, some of the new universities that have popped up in the Arab Gulf that teach in English, right? And I started noticing that there were lots of jobs at prestigious Western universities. I remember seeing one at Oxford, for example, that dealt with Israel studies. And in fact, based just on the job ads, and this is just 1 year, right? Israel studies appears to be a pretty well-established field. Right? I have no problem with this. I'm not complaining. I'm making an observation. Right? In every single job ad I looked at, I never once saw the word Palestine. It didn't exist, nor did the word Palestinian. It was completely erased from the entire set of academic job databases. And so, being curious, I said, well, you know, I'm looking in literature, I'm looking in American studies, you know, okay. So I broadened my search to history, I broadened my search to political science, to sociology, to basically every humanities or social sciences discipline. And again, the word Palestine or Palestinian never appeared. Palestine has been and continues to be systematically excluded from US college campuses, and there's tons of empirical data to back up that argument. Anybody who has gotten active or become interested in Palestine on a campus as either a student or a faculty member knows this to be true. If you're an Arab American like I am, or a Palestinian American even more specifically, you know exactly what I'm talking about when I say that the moment that you got to college and decided in any way to be active, at least a dozen people told you not to do it because it's only going to lead to trouble, right? In fact, if you're a faculty of any ethnic or racial or gender background, you probably have heard, if you've become interested in Palestine, don't say anything until you get tenure. We can argue whether that's good advice or bad advice. I think it's bad advice, right? But that's a conversation for another day. But the point is that that statement can be made with such regularity points to the existence of a structural problem that we need to address, even if our politics are not in alignment. That we don't have to agree on Palestine to agree that the systematic suppression of ideas on college campuses is a problem. Right? You don't have to agree with me on the one state, two state argument, right? To understand that we ought to agree that if ideas and political outcomes cannot be discussed on college campuses, then college campuses are beginning to outlive their usefulness. These are basic functions of the university. They're basic functions of intellectual life. And Palestine, too long, has been excluded from basic functions of intellectual life in the United States. Thankfully, that's beginning to change, but it's beginning to change with a tremendous amount of effort and sacrifice by those in the United States and elsewhere of Palestinian origin and their many friends and allies. And people have been taking tremendous risks in order to make these gains. People have been facing all kinds of threats and punishments for pushing forward this issue and refusing to tone it down or to ignore it altogether. So BDS, it started in 2005, and I was there at sort of the beginning of it, and I say that for no intellectual reason. I'm just kind of bragging because it's something I'm proud of. Sorry, you know, there's a U.S. ACB, the U.S. Campaign for the Academic Cultural Boycott of Israel. Then there's PACB, which is the Palestinian Campaign for the Academic and Cultural Boycott of it. PACB basically is the BDS organizers in Palestine who do their work largely in Arabic and kind of set a lot of the policy because they're the people there on the ground. US ACB are kind of their allies in the United States, and you know, we sort of do our own thing, all kinds of BDS campaigns at scholarly associations on campuses and so forth. But anyway, dozens of acts of proposed legislation over the past 3 or 4 years has been introduced in various states and in various municipalities seeking in some way to curtail or even to outlaw BDS. Mind you, BDS is the nonviolent form of political activism and organizing that the pro-Israel crowd was constantly lecturing Palestinians that they need to engage for decades. Why don't you resist nonviolently? Where's your Gandhi? Where's your Gandhi? It's like, never mind that Gandhi had all kinds of problems himself, but we don't need a Gandhi, right? And we don't need your mythology of a Gandhi. Because if that person actually existed in Palestine, then y'all would arrest him and put him in prison. And in fact, you did. Because there's a guy named Issa Amro, who is a nonviolent activist that people call the Palestinian Gandhi, right? Who has been arrested and, you guessed it, tossed into prison, right? And has been persecuted for the past 2 years. His trial still hasn't ended, as far as I'm aware. Anyway, so we finally done that, right? Well, no, that's completely incorrect, sorry. We've always undertaken forms of nonviolent resistance. You know, the entire range of resistance tactics has been utilized in Palestine's national movement, some violent, some nonviolent. I would ask us also to complicate and to dissolve binaristic notions of what violence and nonviolence are and to think about them in a political context, in a discursive context, because certain of our actions that don't involve any sort of physical activity at all are considered violent. Right? And certain acts of colonial violence don't necessarily involve handcuffs or guns. All right, so what is violent or nonviolent action is not an easy, simplistic, one-way question. All right, it's a hard question, in fact, that philosophers and activists have been arguing about for a very long time. Anyway, BDS is undoubtedly a nonviolent tactic, and it's been criminalized, there's an attempt ongoing to criminalize it. And I don't use the word criminalized lightly. Right? It's not just being discouraged, right? It's, in some cases, there's an ongoing effort to actively criminalize advocates of BDS. Whatever one makes of BDS, its history, its current activities, right? What we need to look at, I would argue, is why this attempt is ongoing. Why activists in the BDS movement are being targeted for punishment, why the Israeli government is devoting tons and tons of resources to crushing the BDS movement. It's really kind of remarkable. So there was a group of about 20 or 21 of us at the beginning, and we met in a standard hotel conference ballroom and sort of helped get this thing off of the ground. And none of us would have ever guessed that 10 years later, the Prime Minister of Israel would be gnashing his teeth about this movement, that it would become the major subject of discussion at AIPAC conferences, right? That heads of state would be putting their heads together, trying to figure out a way to make sure that this movement goes away. We never imagined that. And it's, in that sense, whatever you think of BDS, an inspiring story for activists, that sometimes an idea catches hold, right? And it gets into people's consciousness. And the powers that be try everything in their power to crush it or suppress it, and it doesn't work because the activism was designed to function through attempts at suppression. And what I'm saying is there's no way that you can outlaw BDS. There's no way that you can effectively criminalize it in a way that will make people stop doing it, right? It's there now. It's part of the discourse. It's part of the vocabulary. You cannot unring that bell, all right? You cannot tell people, do not do BDS, because the state tells you not to, because BDS at its essence, right, is positioned in opposition to the dictates of state power. And it always ought to remain that way. That would be an argument that I present to you tonight, particularly to the folks who are involved in BDS or who are supporters of it, and say that it always, like anti-Zionism, ought to be an anti-revolutionary concern. It always ought to be engaged with anti-racist movements, right? Movements against sexual violence, movements for economic equality, or if you prefer less euphemistically, anti-capitalist movements. It should always be engaged where the powerless are struggling for justice and dignity. That's where we ought to position BDS, and more broadly, the movement for Palestinian decolonization. It always ought to be a concern of the wretched. Concern for the wretched, empathy for the powerless are things that can never, ever get legislated out of existence. The very attempt at legislation justifies the existence of the movement and the attendant empathy. We don't do BDS either to check an activist box, to say, okay, I have the right politics. I support BDS, so don't come at me, all right? You don't do it for a sense of credibility in activist or political or intellectual communities. We do it by remembering that BDS is a means toward an end, and that end is the liberation of Palestine. And it won't be simply through BDS that that outcome gets achieved. Right? It will be through a variety of strategies and factors and conversations and conflicts that happen all over the world, but first and foremost in Palestine itself. But that's still the ultimate end goal. And so we should not speak of our commitment to justice for Palestinians through the language of supporting BDS, but through the language of liberating Palestine. That's a better way of thinking about it and a better way of looking at it. I've been talking for a really long time, so I'm going to go ahead and wrap up in a few moments, and I'll be happy to take questions and try to clarify anything I've said. But a few more points before I wrap up this portion of the evening. I've never been a fan of thinking about issues in the world from the point of view of how they affect Americans or how Americans might best understand them. If I maybe can try to clarify that sentence. I don't believe in watering down the issue of Palestinian liberation in order to better comfort the ears of American audiences. It's more important to me to try my best to represent the spirit and the sensibilities of the people who are struggling and suffering in Palestine. And I believe that we ought to do that around any issue, internationally or domestically. That is, if you're a supporter of Black Lives Matter, that your point isn't to appease its opponents, right, but to represent the spirit and the sensibilities of those who suffer structural racism and police brutality, so forth and so on. And I say this because over the years, I and my peers in the Palestine Solidarity Movement have been accused of all manner of horrible things. Right? We've been accused of anti-Semitism, which essentially is being accused of racism. We've been accused of being political purists for insisting that Palestine get represented somehow in traditional sites of U.S. electoral politics, right? We have been made over and over again to apologize for who we are as an entree into the public domain. What I mean by that is we always get asked to denounce terror. We always get asked to renounce violence or to articulate our commitment to nonviolence as a tactic and as a worldview. And then Only after we've satisfied the anxieties of our U.S. audiences are we worthy of hearing. But even then, that listening comes with a set of implicit, sometimes explicit conditions. And I'm interested in working with people to create a kind of language of Palestine solidarity that goes beyond the simple logic of U.S. political cultures. In other words, we don't need to galvanize behind iconic individual politicians as a way of liberating Palestine. Right? That this is something that happens outside of the purview of the U.S. government. We don't need to assure over and over again our colonizers that we're here to absolve them of their guilt, or to tell them that, yeah, everything is okay, when everything isn't okay, and that they have plenty of reason to feel guilty, and that sometimes guilt is good for the development of a decent political consciousness. In fact, I would argue that it's necessary. We don't need to, in short, whittle away at the very foundation of who it is, or who we are as a people, in order to make ourselves tolerable to those who ought to be apologizing to us. That's the sensibility. And that sensibility comes out of years of political work and strategizing and engagement, but more than anything, it comes out of a sense of weariness and fatigue, that this is simply not sustainable any longer, that the suffering of Palestinians, going on close to 100 years now, depending on your timeline, needs to end, and it's time for it to end, that Balfour and his declaration need to be buried and forgotten. That if we are willing or able to admit that Palestinians are human beings just like any other, worthy of equal rights, then we have no choice other than to question the fundamental logic of Zionism. I remember in 2014 what really set me off and set a lot of people off were a set of images that kept circulating. I write about it in Uncivil Rights, of the ice cream freezers and how they were being used in the Gaza Strip to store the bodies of toddlers and children who had been killed. It was summertime. Gaza is hot in the summertime. There was no electricity. Israel had bombed Gaza's only functional power plant. And so in order to prevent the spread of disease and rapid decomposition, they were putting the children in ice cream freezers, and parents were coming and sifting through those ice cream freezers and to see if their children were in there. And there were people justifying this. There were people saying that they deserve it, that it's their parents' fault. And I said to him, this is not going to work any longer. This cannot work any longer. People can't live like this. People cannot be subject to this. These are atrocities. And if we can't find the will to respond to those atrocities in a decent way, then in my mind, humanity becomes irredeemable. And I'm not ready yet for humanity to be deemed irredeemable. Right? I want us to have hope in our ability to form a better world than the one we currently live in. And that better world will never happen as long as people like the Palestinians continue to exist in abject suffering as they are right now, and as long as they continue to be told in ways both explicit and tacit that they're simply going to have to wait for other issues to work themselves out before we responsible political citizens get around to them. They've waited long enough. The time is now. And the simple fact is that by engaging the work of Palestinian liberation, if you're doing it right, you're also simultaneously engaged in any other sort of anti-imperialist work, anti-racist work, anti-sexist work, in other words, that seeks to produce outcomes that make the world a more hospitable place for the poor and the powerless. And that's our charge as people who are interested in Palestine solidarity. And that, in the end, is why we oppose Balfour. That, in the end, is why we oppose any ruling structure that puts the interests of the economic and political elite over the well-being of the other 99.5% of human beings. I'm going to go ahead and stop now with a thanks for hearing me out and listening, and I guess we can get to the conversation Q&A portion, but thank you again. Thank you. Thank you. Please sit down. You all are embarrassing me.
You want to do that side and I do this one?
Sure. Okay. I'll try to take all the questions I can. If we start running out of time, then I'll stack them. I'll take 3 at a time. But we'll go one at a time first. And this gentleman over here, I think, had his hand up first.
I'm going to make a lot shorter. I did 2 tours in Vietnam as an infantry medic. I know killing, I know concentration camps, I know burning villages personally, which is another reason I look at Palestine. I have found other activist friends in Palestine, some we've had on TV show. Here's the point. I became fascinated by Nazi Germany when I was still a kid. And I've studied it and studied it and studied it, and I really got deep into the concentration camps. And I even talked a couple of times with Al Hilberg, who wrote the definitive book, The Destruction of the European Jews, when I was a professor at the University of Vermont. So, I raised this on social media, and I've gotten really ripped on it, and I've basically pointed it out. What is Israel doing? Proceedings without justification. They're taking land. It's not theirs. They're building on property the world recognizes as illegal building. The United States of America has given them everything they want. The only thing, Gaza is an open-air concentration camp, my perspective, and someone said, well, they haven't built the gas chambers and the furnaces. I said, no, they don't need trucks and trains. They drop white phosphorus and napalm on them. And you see social media where Israeli families are sitting on hilltops having a picnic, watching them bomb the hell out of Gaza. So my question is, why isn't, or are there reasons not to, because you can do the wrong thing for the right purposes, not to throw, like, how can Israel do to Palestine essentially what Nazi Germany did to them? I don't get it. And I like to think I'm reasonably right. That's why just a little bit. What's going on with that?
Thank you, sir. That was, and I don't use this word in a pejorative way at all. That was a quality rant. That was, I feel like I ought to give you my honorarium. That was, I mean, I actually, in various ways, get asked some variation of that question pretty regularly, which is, how can this happen? What the hell is going on? How does the world allow this sort of thing to take place? It's not a question that we can necessarily answer simply in context of Palestine. That it's in other words, it's a broader moral question, that we can recognize that horrible injustice is visible everywhere, right, including locally, right? And we, I guess, is in humanity in total, allow that to happen. But as to the question of responsibility, I would say, yeah, we're all responsible for our political passion projects, and we are responsible for the moral implications of the political positions we take up. But an allocation of responsibility for this kind of suffering isn't shared equally across class and political strata. That, in fact, the ruling class and its various puppet governments around the world, first and foremost, are responsible for these sorts of things happening. They're responsible for a police force that exists primarily to protect the interests of private property, right, and corporations and the wealthy more generally. For a corporate media that insists over and over again on portraying those who suffer state violence in various ways as the aggressor. So all of these things, I don't need to keep filling in the blanks, but I guess what I'm trying to say is that yes, we see these things and we allow these things to happen, but for many of us, we allow them to happen insofar as we don't have any of the structural or institutional power to prevent those things from happening or from stopping the Israeli government from dropping bombs on civilian areas. What we do have control over and what we ought to focus on is our own education, our own understanding of how political and economic power function and operate, of our own inherent biases as they've been socialized through a particular political lens that is constantly reinforced by the discourses of corporate media and with the discourses of academe. In other words, we need to continue becoming sharper political consumers. We need to continue becoming sharper critics of corporate media narratives, and we need to make sure that we are always skeptical about the story that keeps getting repeated across supposed ideological lines in mainstream US media. In other words, when both Fox News and CNN are saying the same thing, all right, then we ought to be particularly suspicious. So how can people let it happen? I don't think it's because humans are inherently horrible. I really don't. I don't think it's because humans are unempathetic. I think it's largely because humans all around the world are socialized into systems in which their notion of common sense and political responsibility just happens to supplement the interests of the powerful. And that it takes a lot of work to begin delinking your mind, your soul, really, from these political narratives, and to understand how the commonsensical discourses that we often repeat as, you know, common knowledge or common wisdom or common sense, whatever you want to call it, are in fact imbued with sets of values that end up enacting our own dispossession. So what can we do? We just have to continue being critical consumers. We have to continue speaking on behalf of those who don't get access to platforms themselves. And in the end, we have to be willing to piss off sites of power. And that's a hard decision to make because it's a decision that often comes with consequences. But if we don't, right, then we end up in our own ways. And think about all the times in your life, to my own everlasting shame, that at least metaphorically speaking, we have sat on that damn hill and watched the state perform horrible violence against another community and either cheered it or at the very least thought it was the responsible thing to do. So that's the constant battle that we have to wage in our minds and in our political communities. Other questions or comments?
Right here. Hi.
Oh, hi.
So I have first a request for the audience and then a question for you. The request for the audience is that as you leave here tonight, I hope that you'll stop at each of these tables. There are lots of ways that we can continue this conversation and this struggle beyond tonight's meeting. And one of the tables I wanted to point to is UVM United Academics, the faculty union here at UVM. And I hope you'll stop by that table because I think that there are two interrelated ways that higher education is under attack today. And one is by targeting and drumming out of the academy faculty whose work and speech is critical both of the Israeli state, fighting racism here in the U.S., and so forth. So it's the silencing and firing of critical academics, and then also the defunding of education, and particularly education in the liberal arts, and trying to turn universities, including the University of Vermont, into places that just turn out uncritical thinkers ready to do the work of the state and the ruling class. And so part of what we're doing in United Academics is trying to push back against the defunding of education at UVM and the diversion of the university's resources away from education and towards administration, marketing, and so forth. And so I hope you'll stop by, sign up for our solidarity list, grab a button, get a little info fact sheet that shows that siphoning off of money away from students' educations. And then a question, given that we see in your case, also in the cases of Ward Churchill, Sami Al-Arian, and others, that tenure isn't protection enough for critical academics. Do you have advice for what faculty who do want to bring BDS, bring Palestine into our teaching, and piss off the powers that be, what it is that we can do, or that our professional organizations and unions can do to stop the witch hunting?
Sure. Thank you. That's such a good question, and because it's such a good question, it's also a difficult question. It's important, first of all, to think through the consequences and implications of any political activity that you want to undertake, on or off campus. But let's stick with on campus. Let's say you're a young faculty member or an established, or a mid-career senior faculty member who wants to do something controversial, such as BDS, right? Think it through. What might happen? Are you prepared to deal with the potential consequences, even if those consequences are minuscule? I never intended on getting fired. I didn't, right? It was not an aspiration. It was not something I welcomed. By disposition, I was not cut out to be a quote-unquote public figure. I'm shy. I don't like talking to people. Do you know what I mean? It was just bad all around. But I knew from graduate school that it was worth it to me if it came down to that. That, in other words, I made the choice that I'm not going to be silent around Palestine, even if it means getting in professional trouble. And that was not a choice, importantly, that I made alone. It's a choice I made in conjunction with my family. Right? Well, it was just me and my wife at the time, but I said, look, this is kind of what I'm thinking. I don't expect anything to happen, but this is kind of where I'm at mentally and ethically. I want to be vocal on Palestine. If it means I don't get a job, then I'm willing to accept that consequence. I'll be unhappy with that consequence, right? I won't celebrate that consequence. I'll fight against that consequence, but that it's a consequence I'm willing to accept. And she said, I'm cool with that. Go for it, and I'll support you, And she, when I got fired, she provided unbelievable support, and she continues to. But the point is that it's a collaborative process, not just with your family or your loved ones, but it's a collaborative process with your community members, with your faculty union. You have to open the lines of communication. I think that 10 or 15 years ago, Illinois largely would have gotten away with it. I really do. Part of the reason Illinois didn't get away with it was because I'm a well-established member of USACB that is filled with scholars and academics, many of them with pretty significant media platforms, right, who have a very long history of organizing, who know the media landscape, right, who are not afraid, and who know how to rabble-rouse and raise hell, and that's exactly what they did. They were going to make sure that this did not get dropped, that one of theirs had been harmed, and a harm to one is a harm to all, and they sort of think. So you need to seek communities where that ethic prevails. In other words, don't go it alone. If you have to, you have to, but it's better to have a union. If your university doesn't have a union, as many of them don't, right? It's good to seek political community where acts of solidarity are the norm. And it's good also to understand exactly what you're getting yourself into and what you're willing to do. And you should not, people are surprised when I say this, but I mean it. You should not feel ashamed if you're not ready to take a particular action that might get you in trouble, right? We're at different points in our lives, right? You might be ready in another week or another year or 5 years, but you have to work within a context that, given your circumstances in any given moment, is comfortable enough for you to be able to put time and effort into it, all right? There's not much good comes from showing out and trying to impress others or trying to prove something to yourself. Work within a set of reasonable expectations that work for you in any given moment and that you've thought very clearly about in terms of the potential consequences or the potential rewards. All right? And when I say consequences, I don't mean negative consequences, they're just the consequences in terms of what might happen in the end, what it might do to your life if a certain set of things happen. It might put a spotlight on you. It might make you a pariah. It might earn you a set of enemies, right, that you didn't think you would end up disliking. Right? It might lose you friendships. Right? Palestine, Israel is notorious for ending friendships, right? Everybody who's interested in the topic has lost friends over this, right? Sometimes very close friends. Hell, some people have lost family relationships over it, all right? It runs deep. So you have to think deeply about it and seek community. And in the end, if you choose to do it, whatever you choose to do it right. And do it for the right reason, right? And also remember that standing behind a microphone and saying bad things about state power is not the only form of activism out there. In fact, it might be one of the weakest forms of activism out there. And as somebody who does this, and really this is the primary occupation of my life, I'll happily admit that. This is not necessarily a form of political organizing. Now, if people got together, right, in this room, and when I go to campuses and I have more time, I try to organize them, like an SJP or Faculty for Justice in Palestine. But there are ways of being involved and contributing to any political movement without necessarily being visible. So much of the labor that happens in any activist movement is invisible. So if you don't want to end up on the visible side of it, put yourself on the side where you can remain invisible or anonymous to a degree and put in the effort that way. That was a really long answer, but thank you. Oh gosh, okay. I'm gonna try to take some questions from students, or what I think are students, but okay, there we go.
Hi, my name is Edel. I don't know if this works. So I think that Eve Tuck was really right when she said that decolonization is not simply a metaphor. Instead, it is the immediate repatriation of indigenous land and life. And so I was wondering, writing definitely has its own mobilization in that it is kind of like created within a very specific social and political like time or like moment. So my question is, how do you understand contemporary literary figures as kind of giving this language to decolonization?
Thank you. That's such a fantastic question, and I'm really glad that you asked it. Yeah, do you want to repeat it, or oh, me. Sorry, that's what I was trying to avoid because I know I'm going to butcher it. She's asking about the way that contemporary literary figures sort of enact and reimagine the language of decolonization and how that leads to a certain kind of decolonial practice. Is that? Okay, good. Okay, thank you. All right. And, you know, in a past life, I was a literary critic. I was trained as a literary critic, so I've had some occasion to think about it. I mean, to me, it's what makes both the production and the consumption of literature interesting. Not just because that's what I prefer politically and what tends to interest me. That's true too, but I believe that literary voices are nicely positioned in social structures in order to help us think about things that we either forgot to think about or that we don't want to think about, right? And that to me is it. That sometimes we need to be forced into the places in our mind, right, where our sense of comfort with how the world operates begins to abate. And that's what a good literary culture, or one of the things that a good literary culture does for any society. Also, we should live in a world, and some societies have achieved this already, wherein the language of decolonization, or at least the idea of decolonization, exists enough in the public consciousness to where we can have those conversations without the immediate response being the activation of a vicious sort of xenophobia, where the immediate response is, go home, you're un-American. Go away, you're un-American. Leave, you're un-American. And if we cannot raise that conversation using everyday political discourse, right, then at least we can use, right, if we so choose, certain aesthetic media, right, to raise a set of concerns that perhaps people will engage. I'm not a literary critic anymore, so I can say things that every decent English professor in the world will hate, and one of them is that being a lifelong voracious reader of creative writing, novels particularly, I feel has allowed me to become a much more empathetic human being than I would have been otherwise, if that makes sense. And so there's sites of that empathy being performed and represented that we can reproduce in our political speech as well. Does that make sense? Okay, thank you. Yes, sir. Sorry. Maybe somebody else ought to, I don't know, choose who to. I'm feeling guilty already. Okay.
So usually, when talking about Palestinians, I feel like Palestinians in diaspora are usually forgotten, or most of the time. And from your experience in Shatila camp, I'm wondering, what do you think is stopping Palestinians in countries like Lebanon from having a good life? We know there's been already a couple of generations there. And I feel like it's really important to shed light on why would someone whose parents and grandparents has been in Lebanon for a while, what is going wrong there?
Okay, sure. Thank you. He's asking about the situation of Palestinian refugees in Lebanon, particularly, and why, after 2 or 3 generations, many of them don't seem to have a better life. Like, what's going on there? I don't know if you're looking for a philosophical or a technical answer, but I'm going to provide a technical answer. And if that's not good enough, let me know if you want something more profound. But it's quite simply because they're not given equal rights in Lebanon, including citizenship, right? That Palestinian refugees in Lebanon, or the majority of Palestinian refugees in Lebanon, and I know if somebody in the audience is Lebanese, they might want to argue with me, but I'm sticking again with technical definitions. I know, having lived there for 2 years recently, that this issue evokes a certain kind of passion as well. But quite simply, the Palestinian citizens of refugee camps are not Lebanese nationals, and they have no way to become Lebanese nationals. And because they cannot become Lebanese nationals, they are prevented from working a variety of professions. Now, in the past few years, Israel, see? Oh my goodness. Okay. Now, if you're Lebanese, you're perfectly justified in getting mad at me. Lebanon has eased its restrictions, and there are a variety of so-called white-collar jobs that Palestinians are legally able to work, but it becomes very difficult for them because you know that the way to get into the white-collar technocratic economy is to be rich in the first place, right? Or to have access to that economy in the first place. But up until a few years ago, you know, the Palestinians weren't allowed to become medical doctors, you know, they weren't allowed to become lawyers. There were a whole range of professions from which they were restricted. Also, there's a kind of tense sectarian, or a history of sectarian politics in Lebanon, which means that some of the Palestinians who ended up in Lebanon, some of them have become citizens over the years. And those who have been most likely to become citizens are of Christian origin, or are those who have a lot of money, all right, which is kind of a typical situation for refugees the world over, that if you have some kind of supposedly atavistic identity with the party in power, or if you have a lot of money, then you can gain access. But the majority of Palestinians, right, don't have that sort of access. And the refugee camps, it's kind of hard to explain if you've never been, but Lebanon is a very small country to begin with. They say that its population is 4 million, but there are way more than 4 million people in Lebanon. Way more. All right, you know, they don't even do a census because it would disrupt the confessional balance there, right? You know, and anyway, the point is you have these urbanized areas. Take Beirut, the capital, for example, right? Beirut is a bustling, hectic city, but it covers a very small landmass. It's really compact, all right? And so within that city, right on its southern fringes and surrounded by southern Beirut and the suburbs, is a refugee camp, Shatila, for example, and it's constricted, you know, really to about, I don't even remember, you know, like 12 square blocks. It's a tiny little space, right? And the only way to build is up. And so it keeps going up and up and up and up. And so whenever the army wants to, it can go and surround the camp and close it. All right, so there's a Palestinian refugee camp in the south called Ain Hilwa, and it's periodically closed. In fact, I think it's been closed for many consecutive months now. So there's a checkpoint. So anybody who wants to get in or get out has to go through a checkpoint of the Lebanese army. And a few months ago, the Lebanese government started building a wall around it until people protested, and they stopped. But the point is that they face structural inhibitions to equality or economic mobility in Lebanon that aren't necessarily present in Jordan, where they have citizenship, right? And but this is to say that it's not just in Palestine that Palestinians suffer, and that a lot of Arab states, including the Palestinian Authority, have putrid politics themselves. Does that? Okay. Okay. Sure.
Hello. Hi, my name is Khalid. We are students for justice in Palestine here at UVM. We're students dedicated for fighting for Palestinian rights. And we are going to be meeting on Mondays at the Mosaic Center. It's a brilliant center that presents students of color. We welcome everyone. If you're a liberal, you're welcome to the meeting. If you're a socialist, you're welcome to the meeting. If you're a feminist, if you're black. If you're someone who finds that Israel represents your values, you're welcome to change. Thank you, and please, on leaving, if you wish to sign up to the list, you'll find it on your left. Thanks very much.
To save time, I'm gonna take three I'm gonna take three and then answer. That'll help move it along quickly. And I'd started with this gentleman right there, and then we'll get a few after that too.
So something that's never quite made sense to me, and it's been a little hard for me to wrap my head around, is the academic boycott of Israel, and its part in the greater BDS movement. Earlier tonight, you talked about how Palestine is understudied and how there's sort of this endemic systematic oppression of ideas on college campuses. So for me, that's a little bit of a disconnect. So I'm wondering if you can explain how an academic boycott is not feeding into that, and how it serves the greater BDS goal of Palestinian liberation.
Sure. Okay. Let me take two more, and I'll get to all of them. Yes, sir.
First, an announcement. Other colonized people in Puerto Rico. Some of us had power outages for a couple of days this past week, and there are still people in Puerto Rico who have had no power and no water for 45 days or more now. Anyway, there's a fundraiser for Puerto Rico at Goddard College tomorrow night in Plainfield, 7 o'clock, with all kinds of music. Please come and support. My question, I know you've done a fair amount of work on this topic, but I wonder if you could say a little bit, at least, about the historical analogy between the dispossession of the American Indians and the Palestinians.
Sure. Okay, and one more. Yes, with the, sorry. I'm kind of moving this way, and I'll take three more, I promise.
So my question is a little bit broad, so just feel free to kind of answer it in whatever way comes best to you. I was fortunate enough to spend 4 months last year traveling in and out of West Bank in the fall as a backpacker and as a freelance photographer, just as a hobby of mine. And the two things that I noticed, particularly while I was there, was this extreme contrast between what's happening with essentially war tourism at a lot of the nonviolent protests. The Friday protests that used to happen in Berlin, outside of Ramallah, which have now been discontinued, but you see people demonstrating and the Israeli army dispersing CS gas, but then you also see Chinese tourists with pollution masks and selfie sticks. And then also, too, the commercialization of art. Particularly in Bethlehem, where you're seeing people charging exorbitant amounts of money to find Banksy pieces on the side of car washes, and some of them are being removed and put inside hotels. And so, with that taken into consideration, what do you see as like kind of the way forward with cultural and media resistance within West Bank, within Palestine? Okay,
Thank you for all three questions and comments. I'll try to cover them concisely. I'll probably fail, but I'm going to try. That's as regards to the last comment/question, that's difficult for me to answer. It's been a while since I've been to Palestine. I don't know what the scene looks like now. I'll definitely take your word for it. I can say that one of the most intense arguments I've ever seen broke out on Facebook when Banksy's hotel opened up in Bethlehem. Like, the Palestine Solidarity community was arguing like hell over that. It wasn't the universally lauded thing that a lot of folks sort of made it out to be, but it was to be expected. Like, I can't imagine that somebody didn't sit Banksy, whomever he is, and he's the lead singer of Massive Attack, by the way. I didn't sit him down and say, a lot of Palestinians are going to get pissed off about this, right? A lot of them are going to support you, but a lot are going to get pissed off. But this is part of the problem is it's not just disaster tourism. It's kind of that's an important thing, but it's again working to somehow create a type of economy that isn't reliant on the munificence of the outsider. And that's a huge problem. in the West Bank, and to create a I guess, I don't know how to put it in a way that's at all diplomatic, so I'm gonna have to stop trying to be diplomatic. If people go to Palestine, especially those who aren't Palestinian, they need to get their heads out of their asses and do it right. That they have an obligation to the people that they're visiting, that it's not necessarily the best place to go and build your brand, even though it's an effective place to do that, and that you are there as the guest of an occupied people, and it's from that point of view that you will end up in deep community with those people, where you will feel the full glory of their hospitality, but also that you bring a certain consciousness with you when you go back to where it is, wherever that you came from. That it's not an amusement park, right? It's not a theme park of ongoing warfare. That it's a situation in which humans exist, and that you need to speak about it and represent it. Right, when you are taking photographs, whether they're selfies or otherwise, whether you're buying and trading art, that it's not, in other words, a site to be exploited for attention or for profit. How you stop people from doing that, I have no idea. But again, to me, it comes down to a particular sort of attitude that folks take going into the place, and that should carry over when they leave the place as well. But this is an economy now. Palestine is an economy, or Palestinian oppression or the Palestinian occupation is an economy, and I don't like that economy, but it's there. Right? There's a particular market for it, just like there is a market for the suffering and exploitation of indigenous peoples in North America, which transitions to the other question. I want to just say, read Internationalism, because it's all about those connections, but that seems like a really cheap, self-promoting way to kind of answer it. But very quickly, the main connection between the two situations are really the discourses of settler colonization that you find on both continents, that you'll find in North America and in Palestine. The idea that there is that the United States and Israel are something of a godly event. Right? Something of feats of destiny, or even of predestination, right? The idea of shared values between the two governments. Israeli and American politicians like to talk of shared values, and they're correct. There are a set of shared values. They're just not the shared values of exceptionalism that we're supposed to laud and blindly applaud. That they are a shared values of incarceration, shared values of land expropriation. It's a shared values of militarism. It is a shared values of unfettered, unrestrained capitalism that relies on a kind of global violence to sustain itself. That when Israeli and US politicians sort of congratulate themselves for being the best of friends, that they are the best of friends in the sense that only that they are occupying places where the native must be forgotten, right, in order for the occupier to exist. If you look back at the early European settlement of the U.S., particularly the Northeast, and particularly in what's now Massachusetts, you'll see a lot of the Puritan settlers, particularly talking in the language of the Old Testament, saying that we are Israel in the wilderness, and the natives are Amalek, the natives are the Canaanites, the natives are the Jebusites, and this is our errand into the wilderness, and we have to tame nature. And so all this language of draining swamps, right? All this language of redeeming the land, right? This is one reason why your average American, right? However you want to define that, right? And that's a term that has a lot of values inscribed into it. Finds it so easy to identify with Israel. Right? It's not just geopolitics. It's not just the Israel lobby. It's not just media narratives. It's the fact that Israel is a very familiar story to Americans. A plucky group of underdogs who had faced religious persecution, right, go and redeem themselves in a land, right, that some higher authority had granted to them. This is the American story being reproduced. Right? This is why the Israeli story of settlement, as codified in films like Exodus, which I heard that they're remaking, and I really hope that that's not the case, right? Is something that anybody who's been socialized into any notion of U.S. exceptionalism understands. And so there are forms of resistance that are taking up the cause just of protesting and resisting military occupation, but who are trying to dismantle the very idea of a U.S. or an Israeli exceptionalism, and increasingly they're beginning to do it together. But there's really a lot of interesting comparisons to be made. And then finally, as to the academic boycott, that's a really good question as well. The academic boycott is, so you have the academic, cultural, and economic boycott. The academic boycott, basically, these are its terms. I'll give you a description of them, or a summation of them. Basically says that scholars won't go to conferences or workshops or whatever that are sponsored by Israeli universities or state universities, and that they will not host events outside of Israel that have themselves the sponsorship of Israeli universities or the Israeli state. So in other words, if there were a political science conference here at the University of Vermont, right, and Tel Aviv University wanted to sponsor 2 panels on Israeli democracy or whatever, that the organizer of the conference here would say, no, it violates the terms of the academic boycott. That's one example. Another example is, and this is a simpler one, I get invited to go give a talk at Haifa University. All right? I don't expect that to happen anytime soon, but if they invite me, I would say no, that I refuse to accept the invitation because I will not be party to the sponsorship of the Israeli government. Now it's tricky, and there are all kinds of debates around it. And I think the gentleman who asked the question is correct that it's probably the most controversial of all the features of BDS. But in terms of like academic associations taking up academic boycott, one thing that we ought to remember is that they are unenforceable, right? Like if the ASA, the American Studies Association, passed an academic boycott resolution 3 years ago, maybe 4 years ago now, around 4 years ago actually. And as an ASA member, if I go speak at Tel Aviv University, the ASA can't do anything to me, right? It's kind of a profession of politics more than it is anything else, and there's no systematic means of sort of enforcing it. So I always kind of thought of it as at a level of consciousness and as a way of pointing to the fact that Israeli universities are complicit in the military occupation. Everything from, and this has been pretty well documented, everything from weapons development to logistical support, to the creation of technology for the IDF and these sorts of things. So in large part, it's a profession of opposition to the role that Israeli universities play in acts of Israeli state violence. But anyway, as pertains to all BDS, go to the person who asked the question or anybody else, go to the US ACB website. It's usacbi.org or pacbi.org, and there's a list of criteria, right, for what constitutes academic boycott. Some of you all, especially those of you who are academics, will disagree with some of them. Some of you will agree with them, but check it out for yourself. Make an informed decision and decide whether it's something that you would support or not. I haven't had any guilty pangs supporting it, but for a lot of people, it's been a tough sell. I'll
Okay,
take three more.
You
Or
think
no?
so? I think
Oh,
we
sure.
might be.
Okay, sorry.
People hear me? I think it's time to end.
Oh.
And we've set up the table here for books to purchase and for Steve to sign, if you would like to do that. And if you want to just have a conversation with him more in privately, then you can have that at this point. But I'm seeing a number of heads nodding a little bit. Not because of you, because of fatigue. All right. Thank you.